The night had fallen heavy over New York City, the kind of night where the cold seemed to seep into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. Ethan Blackwood sat in the back of his black town car, watching the city pass by through rain-streaked windows. He hadn't meant to stay so late at the office, but after years of running his own investment firm, work was often the only thing that kept his mind from wandering back to darker times. As the car slowed near an intersection, Ethan's eyes caught something unusual on the sidewalk. A woman, no older than 30, stood hunched against the wind, holding her swollen belly. She looked lost, disheveled, her hair sticking to her face from the rain, and yet something about her posture, her defeat, perhaps, struck Ethan like a punch to the chest. He wasn't the type to get involved in other people's problems, especially after what he'd been through. But something made him pause. "Stop the car," Ethan said, his voice firm. His driver glanced back in the mirror, hesitating for a moment before pulling over to the side of the road. Ethan stepped out into the biting cold, his coat barely shielding him from the sharp wind. The woman hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on cradling her belly and looking around as if unsure where to go next. She was clearly pregnant, likely homeless, and possibly in trouble. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked, his deep voice cutting through the sounds of the city. The woman flinched, turning her head sharply in his direction. Her eyes were wide, startled, and filled with exhaustion. I'm fine," she muttered, though the way she swayed on her feet said otherwise. I just need to find a place to rest." Ethan hesitated for a second, the rational part of him screaming to walk away. This wasn't his responsibility. He'd spent the last 6 years building a life of control, precision, and distance. His mansion in the Upper East Side was his fortress of solitude, a place where nothing unexpected happened, because he didn't allow it. He had rules, and one of those rules was to keep his life orderly, free of the chaos that had once destroyed him. But seeing her like this, a vulnerable woman in the rain, triggered something in him, a memory he thought he had buried long ago. "I can give you a place for the night," Ethan offered, stepping closer. "It's not safe for you to be out here in your condition." Her lips parted, surprise flashing across her face. She looked down at her belly, then back up at him, as if trying to gauge whether or not to trust him. "Why would you do that?" she asked cautiously, her voice weak but guarded. "Because it looks like you could use some help," Ethan replied, softening his tone. "And because no one should be out here tonight, especially not you." There was a long pause where neither of them spoke, the rain continuing to pour down between them. Finally, she gave a small nod, though uncertainty still clouded her features. "I don't have anywhere else to go." "Then it's settled," Ethan said, motioning toward the car. "My driver will take us back to my home. You'll be safe there." Reluctantly, the woman followed him to the car. She moved slowly, one hand on her back and the other supporting her belly. Ethan opened the door for her, and she climbed in with some difficulty, settling into the plush leather seat with a wince. As they drove through the rain-soaked streets, Ethan couldn't help but glance at her from time to time. Her clothes were worn and too light for the cold weather, her face pale and gaunt as if she hadn't had a decent meal in days. But there was something else too, something that tugged at the edges of his memory, though he couldn't place it just yet. "What's your name?" he asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "Emma," she replied softly, not meeting his eyes. "I'm Ethan," he said, though it felt strange introducing himself in this way. It had been years since he had allowed a stranger into his life, and yet here he was, bringing one home. It wasn't just any stranger, though. It was a woman with a child on the way, and there was something about her that unnerved him, a familiarity he couldn't quite shake. They arrived at his mansion sooner than expected. The gates opened slowly as the car rolled up the driveway, the massive house looming against the backdrop of the stormy night. Ethan had always found comfort in its grand architecture, the high ceilings and elegant design offering him a sense of control. But tonight, as he led Emma through the doors, it felt different. The stillness that usually calmed him felt heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Inside, the warmth of the mansion was a sharp contrast to the cold outside. Emma stood in the grand foyer, dripping wet, her arms wrapped protectively around her belly. For a moment, She looked completely out of place in the luxurious surroundings. "I'll have a room prepared for you," Ethan said, signaling to one of the staff. "You can stay as long as you need." Emma nodded again, her eyes darting around the opulence of the room. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so quiet he almost didn't hear it. But Ethan didn't respond. He was too busy grappling with a feeling he hadn't felt in years, a sense that this woman, this stranger, was about to change everything, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. The next morning, the storm had passed, but a quiet tension hung in the air of Ethan's mansion. The sky outside was a soft gray, the sun struggling to break through the clouds. Ethan stood by the large window of his study, a cup of coffee in hand, but his mind was elsewhere. He hadn't slept well. Every time he closed his eyes, flashes of that night, the night he lost everything, came rushing back. The sound of the machines in the hospital, the sterile smell, the hollow ache of loss. Ethan had built walls around those memories, sealed them off with the busyness of his work. But now, with Emma sleeping just down the hall, it was as if the walls were beginning to crack. Something about her presence was unsettling. She was too familiar, though he couldn't put his finger on why. He heard soft footsteps behind him and turned to see one of his housekeepers standing in the doorway. "Mr. Blackwood, the guest has woken up. She's in the dining room now. Shall I prepare something for her?" Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yes, make sure she has whatever she needs." He paused for a moment before adding, "I'll join her shortly." When he entered the dining room, he found Emma seated at the long mahogany table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. She looked better than she had the night before. Her hair was still damp from the shower, but she had changed into a clean set of clothes, likely lent to her by one of the maids. Her pale face had a touch more color, but her eyes still carried the same heavy burden he'd noticed before. "Good morning," Ethan greeted, taking a seat across from her. He had no idea what to say to her, how to start this conversation, but he felt an obligation to at least try. After all, he brought her here. "Morning," Emma replied quietly, her voice still tinged with exhaustion. She offered a small, polite smile but didn't look up. For a few moments, neither of them spoke, the silence only broken by the soft clink of cutlery as the staff prepared breakfast. Ethan studied her, his curiosity growing. Who was she, really? And what had brought her to this point? "You seem a bit better today," Ethan finally said, breaking the awkward silence. Emma nodded. "I am, thank you, for everything. I didn't mean to impose." "You're not imposing," Ethan said quickly. He hesitated. "I just wanted to help." She nodded again, but her posture remained guarded, as though she was still bracing for something to go wrong. Her hands fidgeted with the edge of the tablecloth, and Ethan noticed that she was avoiding any mention of her pregnancy. "How far along are you?" Ethan asked carefully, hoping not to scare her off. He needed to know more about her situation. Emma looked down at her belly for a moment, her expression unreadable. 7 months, she finally answered, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan's brow furrowed. "Do you have someone to support you? Family? The baby's father?" Emma stiffened at the question, her fingers tightening around the teacup. "No," she said flatly. "I'm alone." Her tone made it clear she didn't want to go any further. Ethan could sense the wall she had put up, much like his own, and though he was tempted to push, he held back. Something told him that the truth, whatever it was, would come out in time. "You don't have to tell me anything," Ethan said softly, hoping to ease her tension, "but just know that while you're here, you're safe." Emma finally looked up, her eyes meeting his. There was something deep behind them, fear, pain, and something else Ethan couldn't quite name. She opened her mouth as if to say something but quickly closed it again, the moment passing as swiftly as it had come. "I appreciate that," she said instead, her voice barely louder than a whisper. They continued their meal in silence, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this woman was carrying more than just the weight of an unborn child. She was carrying a story that had somehow become intertwined with his own. That afternoon, as the day wore on, Ethan found himself wandering back to his study, his mind still preoccupied with Emma. He sat behind his desk, staring at the photograph on the wall across from him. It was of him and his wife, Sophia, taken just a few months before her death. She was smiling brightly, her hands resting on her belly, pregnant with the child they would never meet. The pain hit him like a freight train every time he looked at that photo, but he couldn't bring himself to take it down. Losing her had been the defining moment of his life, the event that had changed everything. After Sophia's death, he'd thrown himself into his work, building an empire to distract from the void she had left behind. But no amount of success, no amount of money, had ever been enough to fill it. Now, with Emma's arrival, those old wounds were being reopened. He hadn't thought about that night in years, hadn't allowed himself to dwell on the past. But now it was all rushing back. As Ethan sat there, lost in thought, his phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him back to the present. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from his assistant at the office, something about a meeting he needed to attend tomorrow. But Ethan couldn't focus on that right now. His mind was too clouded with questions. Who was Emma really? What had happened to her? And why did he feel this strange, undeniable connection to her? Later, he found himself walking the halls of his mansion, the house feeling strangely empty despite Emma's presence. When he reached the guest room, he paused outside the door, his hand hovering just above the handle. He knew he shouldn't pry, but his curiosity was getting the better of him. Before he could knock, the door creaked open. Emma stood there, her expression unreadable. "Is everything all right?" she asked quietly, looking at him with those same haunted eyes. Ethan hesitated for a moment before answering. "I was just making sure you're comfortable," he said, feeling slightly foolish now that he was standing there. Emma studied him for a moment, her gaze lingering on his face as if searching for something. Then, much to his surprise, she spoke again, this time with a little more vulnerability in her voice. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly, "for taking me in. You didn't have to." Ethan shook his head. "I don't need your thanks, Emma. Just rest. You and the baby need it." She gave a small nod and took a step back into the room. Before closing the door, she glanced at him one last time. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Emma," he replied, watching as the door clicked shut. As he turned to walk back down the hallway, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that her arrival had set something in motion, something that was only just beginning. The days that followed fell into an uneasy rhythm. Emma stayed mostly in her room, emerging only for meals, her presence a quiet but constant reminder of the unspoken tension that hung between them. Ethan, on the other hand, found himself becoming more and more distracted by her. He tried to focus on his work, but every time he sat down in his office or opened his laptop, his mind drifted back to her, to the way she'd look at him, almost as if she wanted to say something but couldn't bring herself to speak. Late one night, after another restless evening, Ethan decided to go to bed early, hoping sleep might offer him some peace. But when he finally drifted off, the peace he sought eluded him. Instead, the past came rushing back in vivid, unsettling dreams. He was in the hospital again. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered overhead as he paced the waiting room, the sound of hurried footsteps echoing in the distance. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of anticipation and fear. He had been so close to having it all, the wife he loved, the child he had dreamed of. But when the doctor had walked through those doors, his face had been grave. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood," the doctor had said. "We did everything we could." Ethan had felt the world drop out from under him. He had lost both his wife and daughter that night, or so he had been told. In the dream, Ethan ran down the hospital hallway, desperate to reach them, desperate to change the outcome. He burst into the delivery room, but the bed was empty. The sheets were stained with blood, and the machines beeped angrily in the background. Then, from somewhere in the distance, he heard a cry, a baby's cry. "Where is she?" Ethan shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. But no one answered. He searched frantically, opening doors, looking for the source of the cry. Each room was more empty than the last, until finally, he found a small, swaddled bundle in the corner of a dark room. When he reached out to lift the baby, his hands trembled, but as soon as he touched the blanket, it turned to dust, falling through his fingers. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the room grew colder, darker. Then, a voice, soft and almost familiar, whispered from the shadows. You were never meant to know the truth. Ethan jolted awake, drenched in sweat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His heart was racing, the dream still clinging to him, vivid and real. He sat up in bed, running a hand through his hair, trying to shake off the lingering dread that hung over him. The truth? What truth? The dream had felt too real to dismiss, too vivid to ignore. It had stirred up old wounds, wounds he had worked so hard to bury. But now, with Emma in the house, it was as if the past was clawing its way back into the present, refusing to stay hidden. Unable to calm himself, Ethan threw off the covers and made his way down the hall. The house was silent, save for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. As he passed Emma's room, he hesitated. Her door was cracked open, a soft light spilling out into the hallway. He heard movement from within, footsteps, and then the sound of soft sobbing. Ethan paused, his hand hovering near the doorframe. He should walk away, respect her privacy, but something about the sound of her crying pulled at him. Before he could stop himself, he knocked softly. The sobbing stopped immediately. There was a long pause, and then her voice, shaky and quiet, came through the door. Come in. Ethan pushed the door open and stepped inside. Emma was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders shook with the effort of holding back tears. She looked up when he entered, quickly wiping her face with the sleeve of her oversized sweater. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean to wake you. You didn't, Ethan said, sitting down in the chair across from her. I couldn't sleep. Emma looked down, fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. I didn't expect to cry tonight, she said with a bitter laugh. I thought I'd gotten used to feeling empty. Ethan didn't know what to say. He had never been good at offering comfort, not since the night he lost everything. But seeing Emma like this, so fragile and lost, stirred something in him. You don't have to talk about it, Ethan said gently. But if you need someone to listen, I'm here. Emma glanced up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For a long moment, she said nothing, just stared at him as if weighing whether or not to trust him. Then, with a shaky breath, she spoke. I don't know how I ended up like this, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I had everything under control. I thought I could handle this on my own, but I don't know where to go anymore. She paused, her gaze dropping to her hands, as if the weight of her words was too much to bear. I didn't plan for any of this, she continued. I didn't plan to be pregnant, and I didn't plan to be alone. But here I am. Ethan felt a pang of sympathy, but there was something else, something that didn't quite add up. He had a feeling that there was more to her story, that she was holding something back. Why did you come to New York? Ethan asked softly, his eyes searching hers for answers. Emma hesitated, her fingers twisting in her lap. I thought it would be easier here. A fresh start, I guess. But it's been anything but that. And the baby's father? Ethan pressed gently, though he could already sense the answer. Her face tightened at the mention of the father, and she shook her head. He's not in the picture. Never really was. There was a long silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Something about her story didn't sit right with him, but he knew better than to push too hard. Emma was clearly broken, haunted by whatever had happened to her, and the last thing he wanted to do was make things worse. After a few moments, Emma sighed, her shoulders slumping. I'm sorry, she said again. I didn't mean to dump all this on you. I'm just lost. Ethan shook his head. You don't need to apologize. You've been through a lot. And whatever it is, you're not alone now. Emma looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, it seemed like she might say something more, but then she simply nodded, her expression softening just a little. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan nodded in return, but as he left her room that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Emma's story than she was letting on. And deep down, he couldn't ignore the unsettling thought that their lives were somehow intertwined in ways neither of them could yet understand. The following days were marked by a slow, growing tension that neither Ethan nor Emma could ignore. Ethan went about his daily routine, but his mind was constantly pulled back to Emma, the way her words hinted at a deeper pain, the questions she never fully answered. He tried to keep his distance, reminding himself that he had brought her into his home out of compassion, nothing more. Yet, the more time passed, the more the unease gnawed at him. Emma remained mostly to herself, venturing out of her room only for meals or brief moments of fresh air in the garden. Her presence in the mansion was like a shadow, a quiet, looming reminder of the unresolved mysteries that seemed to grow with each passing day. One evening, as Ethan sat in his study trying to focus on work, he found his gaze drifting to the window. Outside, Emma was sitting on a bench, her arms wrapped around her belly, staring at the horizon as the sun dipped below the skyline. There was something about the way she sat there, so still, that tugged at his chest. He couldn't keep ignoring it. He needed answers, not just for her, but for himself. The dream about the hospital kept replaying in his mind, vivid and unsettling, leaving him restless and distracted. He had always prided himself on having control over his emotions, over his life. But now, with Emma's arrival, everything felt uncertain, as if the ground beneath him was shifting. Later that night, unable to sleep, Ethan found himself standing in the hallway outside Emma's room once more. The door was closed, the light off. He debated whether or not to knock, but something inside him hesitated. He didn't want to intrude, but the unanswered questions gnawed at him. His hand hovered over the doorknob, but before he could make a decision, he heard a voice behind him. "I can't sleep either." Ethan turned sharply to find Emma standing at the end of the hallway, wrapped in a robe, her face pale and tired. She offered a small, tired smile as she approached, though her eyes still held that same haunted look. "I didn't mean to startle you," she said softly. "It's fine," Ethan replied, stepping back from the door. "I was just checking on you." Emma looked down, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "You don't have to keep checking on me, Ethan. I know I've caused enough trouble just by being here." "You haven't caused trouble," Ethan said quickly, his voice firm. "I just want to make sure you're okay." For a moment, they stood in silence, the tension between them thick in the air. Emma seemed hesitant, as if debating whether or not to say something. Then, with a soft sigh, she spoke again. "There's more I should tell you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "About why I'm here, and about the baby." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The truth, or at least part of it. "Then tell me," he urged, his tone gentle but firm. "I want to help, Emma, but I need to understand what's going on." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and uncertainty. "It's complicated," she said, her voice wavering, "and I'm not sure where to start." "Start with whatever you can," Ethan encouraged, taking a step closer. Emma hesitated, glancing away for a moment before finally meeting his gaze again. "The baby's father," she began, her voice cracking slightly. "He's not who you think." Ethan frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" "I didn't just leave him because he wasn't around," she continued, her voice shaking now. "I left him because he's dangerous, and he's been looking for me ever since I ran." A cold chill ran down Ethan's spine as her words sank in. This wasn't just a case of a broken relationship. There was something far darker at play. "Dangerous?" Ethan repeated, his mind racing. "What kind of danger are we talking about?" Emma took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped her arms around herself. "He's involved with things I didn't know about when we first met. Illegal things. When I found out, I tried to leave, but he wouldn't let me go. I barely escaped. And now I'm terrified he's going to find me. Find us." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. The weight of her fear was palpable, and suddenly, everything clicked into place. Emma hadn't just been running from her past. She had been running for her life. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Ethan asked, his voice low, trying to keep the frustration out of his tone. "I could have helped you." "I didn't want to drag you into it," Emma said, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't want anyone else to get hurt because of me." Ethan shook his head, stepping closer. "Emma, You're not alone in this anymore. You and the baby, you're both safe here. I'll make sure of that." Emma looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise and relief. For a moment, she seemed lost for words, and then she nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You don't have to thank me," Ethan said softly. "We'll figure this out together." But even as he said the words, Ethan couldn't shake the unease settling deep in his gut. There was more to this story. He could feel it. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Emma's secrets weren't the only ones haunting him. His own past, the dreams, the unanswered questions about that night in the hospital. They were all tangled up in this mess, and he had a sinking feeling that the truth was far more complicated than either of them could imagine. The revelation about Emma's past had shaken Ethan more than he cared to admit. As the days passed, the weight of her fear, of the danger she had narrowly escaped, hung over the mansion like a dark cloud. Ethan found himself more protective than ever, instructing his staff to increase security around the property. He didn't want to take any chances, not with Emma and the baby's safety at risk. But there was something else gnawing at him, something deeper. Her story had opened old wounds that he had long tried to forget. The memory of that hospital, the loss of his wife and daughter, the unresolved questions that had plagued him for years, it was all coming back, sharper now, more urgent. One morning, Ethan stood in his study, staring at the framed photo of Sophia again. He hadn't spoken her name in years, and yet it had been on the tip of his tongue ever since Emma arrived. The similarities between the two women haunted him. It wasn't just the timing of Emma's pregnancy or the way she had come into his life out of nowhere. It was the way she moved, the way she spoke. Something about her felt almost familiar. As if reading his thoughts, there was a knock on the study door. Emma stepped in hesitantly, her face pale but determined. She hadn't said much since their conversation about her ex, but today, there was something different in her eyes. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice steady but soft. Ethan motioned for her to sit, but she remained standing, as if bracing herself for something difficult. "What is it?" Ethan asked, his heart already picking up pace. "There's something else," she began, her hands twisting together. "I've been trying to figure out the right time to tell you, but I don't think there is one. I need to show you something." Without another word, Emma walked over to the small bag she had brought with her when she first arrived. She reached inside and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn from being handled so many times. She handed it to Ethan, her hands shaking slightly. Ethan unfolded the paper slowly, his eyes scanning the familiar words printed on it. It was a birth certificate, but it wasn't for Emma's unborn baby. It was for a baby girl, born on the same day his daughter was supposed to have been born. His heart raced as he read the name on the certificate, Elena Blackwood. He looked up at Emma, confusion and disbelief written across his face. "What is this?" he asked, his voice strained. Emma swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with tears. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I didn't know how to explain." "Explain what?" Ethan's voice was low, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He was struggling to connect the dots, but the implications were terrifying. "I think," Emma's voice broke, and she took a deep breath before continuing. "I think Elena is your daughter." The room seemed to spin for a moment. Ethan felt the floor shift beneath him, his mind racing to process what she was saying. His daughter? The one he had been told was stillborn? "No," Ethan whispered, shaking his head. "No, that's impossible. My daughter died. Sophia died. They both. Emma's tears began to fall, but she didn't flinch. "Ethan, I know how it sounds, but I'm telling you the truth. I was there that night. I know what happened." Ethan stood abruptly, his pulse thundering in his ears. "What are you talking about? How could you possibly know what happened?" Emma took a shaky breath. "Because I was in that hospital. I was there when Elena was born. I saw them take her away." Ethan's heart stopped. His chest felt tight, like he couldn't get enough air. "What do you mean, take her away?" "They told you she died, but that wasn't the truth," Emma said, her voice trembling. "Your daughter didn't die, Ethan. She was taken by the same people who were after me." Ethan's mind reeled. This couldn't be true. How could this be true? He had spent years mourning his daughter, living with the grief that had consumed him after Sophia's death. And now, this woman was standing in front of him, telling him that everything he had believed was a lie? Why would they do that? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why would they take her? I don't know all the details, Emma admitted, but I know they were involved in some kind of illegal activity, human trafficking, money laundering, I'm not sure. When I got mixed up with them, I overheard things I wasn't supposed to. That's when I found out about Elena. They told me she was adopted, but I knew something wasn't right. That's why I ran. That's why I came here. I couldn't live with it anymore. Ethan stood frozen, every muscle in his body tense as he tried to make sense of her words. His daughter, alive? The thought sent a jolt of hope and fear through him. But just as quickly, doubt crept in. How do I know you're telling the truth? He demanded, his voice harsh with desperation. How do I know you're not just making this up? Emma's face crumpled. I'm not making this up, she whispered. I swear to you, Ethan, I wouldn't lie about this. I had no idea who you were when I came here. But when I found the birth certificate, when I realized who you were, I knew I had to tell you the truth. Ethan stared at her, his mind racing with questions. If what she was saying was true, then his entire world had been built on a lie. The daughter he had thought he lost was out there somewhere, alive. But if Emma was telling the truth, then finding her wouldn't be easy. Whoever had taken Elena had gone to great lengths to cover it up. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as a wave of determination swept over him. He had spent years building walls around his heart, protecting himself from the pain of losing his family. But now, if there was even the slightest chance that his daughter was alive, he had to do something. He couldn't just let this go. We need to find her, Ethan said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. We need to find Elena. Emma nodded, relief flooding her features. I'll help you. I'll do whatever it takes. Ethan turned away, his mind already racing with plans. He would find the people responsible for this. He would make them pay for what they had done. But most importantly, he would find his daughter, no matter what it took. As he stood there, staring out the window into the darkening night, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years, hope. But with that hope came a new fear, one that was even more terrifying than the grief he had carried for so long. Because now, the stakes were higher than ever. The days following Emma's revelation felt like a blur to Ethan. His world had been turned upside down. Every certainty he had about his past suddenly shattered. He was consumed by a new, desperate mission, finding Elena. If she was alive, and God, he hoped she was, he wouldn't rest until she was back where she belonged. But the more he thought about it, the more questions plagued him. How had this happened? Who had orchestrated the lie about her death, and why? Ethan's first step was to contact a private investigator. He knew that whoever had taken Elena would have covered their tracks, but if there was even a slim chance of finding a lead, he was willing to take it. Over the years, his wealth had afforded him powerful connections, but he had never needed to pull them together like this. "You're sure about this?" asked Caleb Richards, the investigator Ethan hired, standing in the middle of his study, flipping through the birth certificate that Emma had given him. "This is a pretty big leap, Ethan. If we go down this road and the evidence doesn't hold up..." "I'm sure," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I need you to dig into every adoption in the state around that time, every hospital record, every suspicious detail. And I need you to be discreet." Caleb nodded, tucking the certificate into his folder. "I'll get started right away. But if what you're saying is true, then whoever took her has some powerful connections. This won't be easy." "I don't care how hard it is," Ethan replied, his jaw tightening. "Just find her." As Caleb left, Ethan stood by the window, staring out at the city beyond his estate. The skyline, usually a symbol of his success and control, now felt like a towering reminder of how much had slipped through his fingers. His daughter was out there somewhere, and for years he had mourned her loss, never knowing she might have been alive all along. But it wasn't just about finding Elena. It was about confronting the darkness that had taken her away. Someone had orchestrated this. Someone had stolen his child, and Ethan knew that they wouldn't stop until the truth was buried for good. Emma appeared at the door, her presence gentle but tense. "How did it go with the investigator?" "He's on it," Ethan said without turning around. "But this could take time, and time's not something we can waste." Emma nodded, stepping closer. "I can help. I still know people, dangerous people, who might have information. I left that world, but I remember enough to know who to ask. If I could just talk to them, maybe they'd tell me where to look." Ethan hesitated. The idea of Emma getting involved with the people who had nearly destroyed her made him uneasy. But if they were going to find Elena, they needed every advantage. "You're sure you can handle this?" Ethan asked, his voice laced with concern. "These aren't people you can just walk away from again." "I know," Emma said, her expression hardening with determination. "But this is about more than just me now. I can't let them get away with what they did to Elena. To you." Ethan studied her for a moment, the tension between them thick. Emma's resolve was fierce, but there was fear behind her eyes, a fear he shared. They were stepping into dangerous territory, and neither of them knew where it would lead. But the weight of their shared mission was stronger than their fear. "We'll do this together," Ethan finally said. "But you don't have to face them alone. Whatever happens, we'll find Elena, and we'll bring her home." The next evening, Emma sat nervously in the back of a small, dimly lit bar on the outskirts of the city, waiting for her contact. Ethan had wanted to come with her, but she insisted on going alone. The man she was meeting was dangerous, someone who had once worked with the people who had taken Elena. If he saw Ethan, he would bolt. She had to be careful, act like she was still a part of that world. The door creaked open, and a tall, muscular man with a cold, calculating look entered the bar. His name was Vince, and he had once been the kind of man who could ruin lives with a single phone call. Emma's heart raced as he approached, taking a seat across from her. Well, Vince said with a sly grin. "Emma Stone, back from the dead. I figured you were long gone by now." "I thought I was," Emma replied coolly, trying to mask the nervous energy buzzing through her. "But I need information, and I think you're the only one who can give it to me." Vince leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "Information's expensive, especially when it's for someone who vanished without a trace." "I'm not looking for a freebie," Emma said, sliding an envelope full of cash across the table. "I need to know about a child, one that was taken about 7 years ago. I think you were involved." Vince's smirk faded slightly, his eyes flicking down to the envelope. He didn't move to take it. "I'm out of that game," he said flatly, though his voice carried a trace of uncertainty. "I know you're not," Emma countered. "And if you don't help me, I'll make sure your name gets out to the wrong people. You know what that'll mean." Vince's jaw tightened. Emma had hit a nerve, and she knew it. His eyes flicked around the room, checking for any unwanted attention. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're walking a fine line, Emma. Asking about that kid. You don't know what you're getting into." "I know enough," Emma replied, leaning forward. "Now tell me what you know. Where is Elena Blackwood?" Vince's eyes darkened. "That name hasn't come up in years," he muttered, his voice low. "But I remember the job. It wasn't supposed to go down like that. The kid was meant to disappear, get adopted out to some rich couple who wanted a child without all the legal headaches. But something went wrong." Emma's pulse quickened. "What went wrong?" "There was someone else involved," Vince said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone higher up. They didn't want the kid getting out of sight. I don't know why, but I heard they kept her close, real close." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. If Elena had been kept close, that meant she might still be nearby. But the idea of her daughter being controlled, hidden away for years, sent a cold wave of fear through her. "Who was it?" Emma pressed. "Who's behind this?" Vince shook his head. "I don't know the names, but I can tell you where to start looking. There's a man. He's not the kind you want to mess with, but he knows where the bodies are buried, so to speak." He scribbled down an address on a napkin and slid it across the table. "Don't say I didn't warn you." Emma grabbed the napkin, her hand shaking slightly. "Thank you," she said, rising to leave. "Don't thank me yet," Vince muttered. "You're opening a door you can't close." Later that night, back at the mansion, Emma handed the address to Ethan. His face was tense as he stared at the small piece of paper, knowing that this would be the next step in their dangerous journey. "This is it," Emma said, her voice soft but steady. "It's the lead we've been waiting for." Ethan nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead. They were getting closer to the truth, but the danger was growing with every step. Whoever had taken Elena had covered their tracks well, and whoever was keeping her now wouldn't let her go without a fight. But Ethan didn't care. He had lost too much already, and he wasn't about to lose his daughter again. "We'll go in the morning," Ethan said, his voice firm. "We're finding Elena, and we're bringing her home." Morning arrived with a heaviness that neither Ethan nor Emma could shake. The quiet tension between them was palpable as they prepared for the next step in their search for Elena. Both knew that the address Vince had given them would either be a breakthrough or a dangerous dead end. Either way, the truth was close now, closer than it had ever been. Ethan stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of his jacket. His face was pale, the weight of everything hanging over him like a storm about to break. He had spent the entire night lying awake, replaying every moment of the past 7 years in his mind. The memories of losing Sophia, the devastation of believing their daughter had died. All of it was now swirling into a tidal wave of emotions. And under all that, a single thought had settled into his mind. What if they were too late? He glanced at Emma, who was standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable, but her eyes filled with determination. She had barely slept either, her own anxieties gnawing at her from within. But now, there was no turning back. "Are you ready for this?" Ethan asked, his voice low as he turned to face her. Emma nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. "I don't think I'll ever be fully ready," she admitted. "But we don't have a choice. We have to see this through." Ethan stepped closer, his gaze softening. "No matter what we find, we'll face it together." She looked up at him, gratitude and fear battling in her eyes. "I know," she whispered. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." He nodded once, offering a brief, tight smile. Then, without another word, they left the mansion and drove toward the address Vince had given them. A small, nondescript warehouse tucked away in an industrial part of the city, far from prying eyes. The warehouse stood at the end of a desolate street, its rusted doors and cracked windows giving it the look of a place long forgotten. Ethan parked the car a block away, the tension in the air thickening with each step they took toward the building. "We should be careful," Emma whispered as they approached the entrance. "This place doesn't feel right." Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "I know. Stay close." They reached the large metal door, which groaned as Ethan pushed it open just enough for them to slip inside. The air inside the warehouse was cold and damp, the smell of mildew heavy in the air. They found themselves in a dark corridor, the dim light from outside barely illuminating their path. "Where do we even start?" Emma whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising fear in his chest. "We look for anyone who might have answers. Stay alert." As they ventured deeper into the warehouse, the space opened up into a larger room. In the center of it stood a man. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a menacing presence, his back turned to them as he rummaged through a desk cluttered with papers. When he turned around, his cold eyes immediately locked onto Ethan and Emma. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice gruff as he took a step toward them. Ethan stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. "We're looking for someone, a girl named Elena." The man's eyes narrowed. "You've got the wrong place. Get out." "We know she was taken," Emma said, her voice stronger than she felt. "And we know you know where she is." The man's lips twisted into a sneer. "You don't know anything?" Ethan stepped forward, anger rising inside him. "We know enough," he said through gritted teeth. "You can either help us, or we'll make sure the authorities know about every illegal thing going on here. Your choice." The man's expression darkened. For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze shifting between Ethan and Emma as if weighing his options. Then, without warning, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a gun. Ethan's heart stopped, his hand instinctively grabbing Emma's arm and pulling her behind him. "You're making a mistake," the man growled, stepping closer. "Turn around and walk out. This is your last chance." Ethan could feel Emma trembling behind him, but he stood firm, his mind racing for a way out of the situation. He had come too far to walk away now, not when they were so close. "Listen to me," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "We don't want trouble. We just want the truth. Where is Elena?" The man's grip on the gun tightened, his finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger. For a tense moment, it seemed like all hope was lost. But then, something shifted in the man's eyes. Hesitation, doubt. He lowered the gun slightly, his jaw clenched. "You really want to know where she is?" Ethan nodded, his pulse racing. "Yes." The man exhaled sharply, as if he had finally come to a decision. "You're looking in the wrong place," he muttered. Stepping back toward the desk, he tossed a small, folded piece of paper onto it. "Take it. It's the address you need." Ethan didn't move at first, wary of a trap. But the man's expression had shifted. There was a flicker of something that looked almost like regret in his eyes. Slowly, Ethan stepped forward, picking up the paper. "You've got what you came for," the man said, his voice low. "Now get out, and don't come back." Without another word, Ethan and Emma backed out of the warehouse, the tension in the air finally breaking as they made their way to the car. Once inside, Ethan unfolded the paper, his hands shaking slightly. The address on the paper wasn't just a random location. It was a private residence, one Ethan recognized. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the name written on the page. It was a name he knew all too well. "It's someone I know," Ethan whispered, his voice filled with shock. "It's someone I trusted." Emma leaned over, her eyes widening as she read the name. "What does this mean?" she asked, fear creeping into her voice. "It means—" Ethan swallowed hard, his mind spinning. "It means the person who took Elena was closer than I ever realized." The silence in the car was thick as Ethan drove through the dimly lit streets, the name on the paper burning into his mind. The address, the person it led to. It was more than he could handle. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white as the full weight of the revelation pressed down on him. Emma sat beside him, her face pale, the same shock etched into her features. The address belonged to Michael Thorne, his longtime business partner, the man who had stood by his side for years, through every storm, every success. The man who had been there the night his wife died, the night his daughter was supposedly taken from him. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, anger and confusion swirling into a storm of emotions. He had trusted Michael, trusted him with his company, his life. How could it have been him all along? How could Michael have orchestrated something so monstrous? "I don't understand," Emma said quietly, her voice trembling as she broke the silence. "Why would he do this? What could he possibly gain?" Ethan shook his head, his jaw clenched. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." As they neared Michael's estate, a sprawling property on the outskirts of the city, Ethan felt a wave of dread wash over him. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and stability, now felt like a house of lies. The person who had been a constant in his life, the one he had relied on for years, had been hiding a terrible secret, one that had stolen 7 years of his daughter's life. Ethan parked the car just beyond the gates, not wanting to draw attention. He and Emma sat in the car for a moment, gathering their thoughts, before Ethan finally spoke. "This could go bad," he said, his voice low but resolute. "We don't know what we're walking into." Emma nodded, though her face was tight with fear. "But we have to do this. For Elena." Ethan's chest tightened at the mention of his daughter's name. Elena, his little girl, the daughter he had thought was lost forever, was so close now. But if Michael had been keeping her hidden, who knew what kind of life she had been living? The thought of her suffering, of her being alone all this time, filled him with rage. "We need to be careful," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Michael's dangerous, and if he's been involved in this, we can't trust him." Emma's hand trembled as she reached for the door handle. "I'm ready." Together, they approached the gates of the estate, the tension between them palpable. Ethan entered the code he had memorized years ago, the same one he had used countless times before, and the gates swung open with a creak that echoed in the night. The walk to the front door felt longer than usual, every step heavy with the weight of betrayal. When they reached the entrance, Ethan hesitated for a moment before knocking. the sound of his fist on the heavy wood door reverberating through the night air. Seconds passed, and then the door opened, revealing Michael standing in the doorway, a look of surprise flickering across his face. He was still dressed in his business attire, as if he hadn't expected company this late. "Ethan," Michael greeted, his voice cool and composed, but his eyes held a flicker of something darker, something that didn't sit right. "What are you doing here? Is everything all right?" Ethan's blood boiled at the sight of him, but he forced himself to stay calm, his fists clenched at his sides. "We need to talk," he said, his voice tight. "Now." Michael's eyes shifted briefly to Emma, and Ethan could see the subtle shift in his expression, an unease that hadn't been there a moment ago. He stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. "Of course. Come in." Ethan stepped inside, his heart pounding as the door closed behind him. The familiar scent of expensive cologne and polished wood filled the air, but it felt suffocating now, knowing the truth that lingered beneath the surface. They followed Michael into his office, a large, stately room lined with dark wood and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the estate grounds. Michael sat behind his desk, his posture relaxed but guarded, watching them with a cool, calculating gaze. "So," Michael began, folding his hands on the desk in front of him, "what's this about, Ethan?" Ethan's jaw tightened, his voice cold as ice. "You know exactly what this is about, Michael." For a moment, Michael's face remained impassive, but then a slow, deliberate smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "I'm not sure I do. Why don't you enlighten me?" Ethan leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Where is she?" Michael's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "Who, exactly, are you referring to?" Ethan slammed his fist on the desk, his patience snapping. "Elena, my daughter. You've been keeping her all these years, haven't you?" Michael's eyes darkened, and the room grew heavy with tension. For a moment, no one spoke, the air thick with the weight of the accusation. Then, Michael leaned back in his chair, his smile fading as he regarded Ethan with a cold, detached look. "I did what had to be done," Michael said finally, his voice calm but laced with something sinister. "You weren't ready to raise a child, Ethan. Not after Sophia died. You were a mess, spiraling out of control. Someone had to step in." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his hands trembling with rage. "You took my daughter from me. You lied to me. You let me believe she was dead." Michael's expression remained cold, unflinching. "I gave her a life, a better life than you could have given her. I put her with people who could care for her, people who weren't drowning in grief." Ethan's vision blurred with fury, his fists clenching at his sides. "You had no right to make that decision for me." Michael shrugged, his gaze unwavering. "You were too weak to make it yourself. You needed someone to make it for you." Ethan lunged forward, grabbing Michael by the collar and pulling him halfway across the desk. "Where is she?" he growled, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. Michael's eyes gleamed with something close to amusement. "I don't know where she is now," he said calmly. "The people I placed her with, they took care of everything. I've kept my distance. But I do know one thing, Ethan. If you keep pushing, you'll never find her." The words sent a cold chill through Ethan's body. He released Michael, stepping back, his mind racing. Michael had been manipulating him from the start, playing on his grief, his vulnerability, to cover up his own actions. And now, his daughter's whereabouts were still a mystery, dangling just out of reach. Emma, who had been standing silently by the door, finally spoke, her voice trembling with fear and anger. "Why would you do this? How could you steal a child and lie to her father?" Michael's gaze shifted to her, and his lips curled into a cruel smile. "You don't understand how the world works, do you? It's about control, power." Ethan needed to be controlled, and Elena was a means to an end. Ethan's hands shook with fury, but he forced himself to stay calm. He needed to think clearly if he was going to find Elena. Michael wasn't going to help them, not willingly. But there had to be something, a clue, a lead that would point them in the right direction. "Tell me where to start," Ethan demanded, his voice steady but filled with cold determination. "If you won't help me, then at least tell me where they took her." Michael hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering with something close to regret. Then, he sighed, reaching into his desk drawer and pulling out a small card. He tossed it onto the desk. "That's the last address I had," Michael said flatly. "But it's been years. I can't guarantee she's still there." Ethan snatched the card, his eyes scanning the address. His pulse quickened. It was another location, a small town miles away. It was the only lead they had, and he wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers. Without another word, Ethan turned and stormed out of the office, Emma following closely behind. As they reached the car, Ethan's hands shook with adrenaline, his mind racing with thoughts of what they would find at the next stop. "Elena," Ethan whispered to himself, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. "We're coming." The drive to the small town felt like it stretched on forever. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly, the muscles in his jaw tense as he fought to keep his focus. Every second that ticked by felt like an eternity, knowing that they were finally on the verge of finding Elena. Emma sat quietly beside him, her face pale but determined, her hands clenched in her lap. The tension between them was suffocating, their shared anxiety palpable as the miles blurred together. Neither of them spoke, lost in their thoughts. The address on the card Michael had given them led to a remote town, far from the life of wealth and power Ethan had built. He couldn't stop thinking about how much time had been stolen, how many memories they could have made if only he had known the truth sooner. As they drove deeper into the countryside, the landscape changed, giving way to rolling fields and dense woods. It was peaceful, almost idyllic, but the serenity only heightened the tension that gripped Ethan's heart. Somewhere out here, his daughter was living a life without him, living a lie, while he had spent years grieving her supposed death. When they finally arrived, the town was quiet, almost eerie in its stillness. The narrow streets were lined with modest houses, each one seeming more ordinary than the last. Ethan pulled up in front of a small, two-story home with a white picket fence and an overgrown garden. It looked unremarkable, just another house in a quiet neighborhood. But to Ethan, it felt like the culmination of everything he'd been through. Every sleepless night, every moment of doubt. "This is it," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma nodded, her eyes wide with apprehension. "Do you think she's here?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted, his heart pounding in his chest, "but we're about to find out." They stepped out of the car, the sound of gravel crunching under their feet as they approached the front door. Ethan's hand trembled slightly as he raised it to knock, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Every fiber of his being hoped, no, needed, to believe that Elena was behind this door, that after all these years, he would finally see his daughter again. The door creaked open, revealing a woman in her early 40s with soft, kind eyes and graying hair pulled into a loose bun. She looked at Ethan and Emma with a puzzled expression, her brow furrowed as if trying to place them. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice warm but wary. Ethan cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm looking for someone. A girl. Her name is Elena." The woman's face paled slightly at the mention of the name, but she quickly masked her reaction, her gaze flicking to Emma before settling back on Ethan. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice more guarded now. "There's no one by that name here." Ethan's heart sank, but he wasn't ready to give up. "Not now. Please," he said, his voice pleading. "I've been searching for her for 7 years. I know she's here. Just tell me where she is." The woman hesitated, her eyes softening as she took in the desperation in Ethan's voice. She glanced over her shoulder, as if checking to see if anyone was watching, then stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "I don't know who you are," she said softly, "but you need to understand something. Elena, she doesn't know about you." Ethan's stomach twisted, the weight of her words hitting him like a blow. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "She's been living here for as long as she can remember," the woman explained. "She's been told her parents died when she was a baby. She doesn't know about any of this. About you." Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him, the enormity of what had been stolen from him settling in like a dark cloud. His daughter had been living a lie, believing that he and Sophia were gone, that she had no family left. "Please," Ethan said again, his voice cracking. I need to see her. I need to tell her the truth. The woman hesitated, her face etched with worry. If I let you see her, it will change everything for her. You need to be prepared for that. I am, Ethan said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. I just need to see her. The woman studied him for a moment, then sighed, stepping back and opening the door. She's in the backyard, she said quietly. I'll give you a few minutes. Ethan nodded, his heart pounding as he stepped inside the house. The air felt thick, the walls closing in as he made his way through the small living room and out the back door. Emma followed silently, her own breath catching as they stepped outside. And there she was, a young girl, no older than 7, sat on a swing set in the middle of the yard, her long brown hair flowing behind her as she swung back and forth. She wore a simple dress, her bare feet kicking at the dirt as she laughed softly to herself, lost in the innocent joy of childhood. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, tears stinging his eyes as he took in the sight of her. She looked so much like Sophia, the same dark hair, the same bright smile. But there was something more, something deeper. He could feel it in his bones. This is my daughter. Elena, he whispered, his voice trembling. The girl looked up, startled by the sound of her name. Her swing slowed to a stop as she stared at Ethan, her wide brown eyes filled with curiosity and confusion. Who are you? She asked softly, her small voice carrying across the yard. Ethan's heart ached with the weight of the moment, every second stretching out like a lifetime. He took a shaky step forward, his hands trembling as he knelt down to her level. I'm your father, he said, his voice cracking. I've been looking for you for so long. Elena's brow furrowed in confusion, her young mind struggling to make sense of what she was hearing. But my parents are gone, she said, her voice trembling slightly. That's what I was told. Ethan felt a tear slip down his cheek as he shook his head. No, sweetheart, that's not true. I'm here. I've always been here. Elena stared at him for a long moment, her small hands gripping the chains of the swing as her mind raced to process the truth. Behind her, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the yard, the warmth of it in stark contrast to the chill that gripped Ethan's heart. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Elena spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. You're really my dad? Ethan nodded, tears streaming down his face as he reached out to her. Yes, Elena, I'm your dad. For a moment, neither of them moved. And then, with a soft, shaky breath, Elena let go of the swing and took a small step forward, her eyes searching his face as if trying to see the truth in his eyes. And then she ran to him. Ethan caught her in his arms, holding her tight as he wept, his heart breaking and healing all at once. He had spent 7 long years searching for this moment, and now, finally, he held his daughter in his arms. Behind him, Emma watched silently, her own tears slipping down her cheeks. The reunion they had fought so hard for had finally come, but the cost of the years lost, of the pain they had endured, would forever haunt them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Ethan whispered into Elena's hair, his voice thick with emotion. I'm never letting you go again. The quiet after the storm felt surreal. Ethan sat on the porch of the small house, Elena nestled in his lap, her head resting against his chest. The sun had long since set, and the sky was painted with the soft hues of twilight. The moment was fragile, like a dream he was afraid would shatter if he moved too quickly. He could feel her small breaths against his chest, the warmth of her little body pressed close to his, and it filled a void that had been left empty for far too long. Inside the house, Emma stood by the window, watching them in silence. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was a small, bittersweet smile on her face. She had played her part in reuniting them, but the weight of everything that had happened still pressed heavily on her shoulders. The years they had all lost, the secrets, the lies. There was no undoing any of it, but there was a chance for healing, for a new beginning. Ethan gently stroked Elena's hair, his heart still racing from the emotions of the day. He had never imagined this moment, never thought he would have the chance to hold his daughter again, to feel her in his arms. The pain of the years they'd been apart was still there, but it was overshadowed by the overwhelming relief of finally having her back. "How long do we have to stay here?" Elena asked quietly, her voice soft but curious. Ethan kissed the top of her head, his throat tight. "Not long, sweetheart. Just until we're ready to go home." "Home," she repeated, as if the word itself was unfamiliar. For 7 years, this small house had been her home, with a woman she had thought was her mother. The idea of leaving it behind for a life she knew nothing about was overwhelming, even for a child as resilient as her. Ethan knew it wouldn't be easy. Rebuilding their life together would take time, and there were still so many things she didn't know. About him, about her mother, about everything that had happened. But for now, all that mattered was that they were together. "We'll go slow," he promised her, his voice low and soothing, "but I'll be with you the whole time. I'm not going anywhere." Elena turned in his lap to look up at him, her eyes wide and filled with questions. "Why did you go away?" The question cut deep, but Ethan had been preparing for it since the moment he found out she was alive. How could he explain everything to her in a way that made sense? How could he tell her that someone he trusted had taken her away, stolen the years they should have spent together? "I didn't want to, Elena," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought you were gone, but I was wrong. I should have found you sooner. I'm so sorry." Elena didn't fully understand, but she seemed to accept his answer. She leaned her head back against his chest, her small fingers gripping his shirt as if she was afraid to let go. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're here now." Ethan closed his eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. He had never felt more grateful for anything in his life. He held her tighter, as if he could make up for the lost time by never letting her go again. After a while, Emma stepped out onto the porch, her footsteps soft against the wooden floor. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, they just stood there in silence, the weight of everything that had happened between them hanging in the air. "I can't believe it's real," Emma said quietly, her voice full of awe as she looked at Elena. "I was starting to think we'd never find her." "We did," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Because of you." Emma gave a small, sad smile. "I just wish I'd done more sooner." Ethan shook his head. "You did more than enough. You brought her back to me." Emma hesitated, glancing back at the house before stepping closer. "What happens now?" Ethan sighed, looking down at Elena, who had fallen asleep in his arms. "We go home. We start over." "And Michael?" Emma asked softly, her eyes darkening at the mention of his name. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had been so focused on finding Elena that he hadn't had time to process the betrayal, to truly feel the full weight of what Michael had done. But now, with Elena safe in his arms, the anger surged back, hotter than ever. "I'm going to make sure he pays for what he did," Ethan said, his voice hardening. "For stealing her, for lying to me, for everything. He's not going to get away with it." Emma nodded, though there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. "Be careful, Ethan. He's dangerous. He won't let you take him down easily." "I don't care how hard it is," Ethan said firmly. "He's going to pay." They stood in silence for a moment longer, the night air cool around them. Ethan knew there was still so much to do, so much to figure out. But for now, all that mattered was that Elena was safe. They had a future ahead of them, a chance to rebuild the life that had been stolen from them. "Thank you, Emma," Ethan said after a long pause, his voice soft but sincere. "For everything." Emma smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad she's safe." Ethan nodded, looking down at Elena again, his heart swelling with love for the little girl who had been stolen from him but was now finally back where she belonged. A week later, the house was filled with the soft sounds of laughter. It was the sound Ethan had been waiting to hear for 7 years, the sound of his daughter, happy and carefree. Elena had adjusted more quickly than he could have hoped, her resilience and curiosity shining through as she explored the new home they were building together. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, watching as Elena and Emma played a game in the living room, their laughter echoing through the house. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a sense of peace. But even as they settled into this new life, the shadow of what Michael had done still loomed over him. Ethan had made arrangements to pursue legal action, to bring Michael to justice for his role in the conspiracy that had taken Elena. It would be a long battle, but Ethan was prepared to fight for his daughter. In the end, though, what mattered most was that they had found each other again. The years they had lost would never be recovered, but they had the future ahead of them, a future filled with hope, love, and the promise of new beginnings. That night, as Ethan tucked Elena into bed, he sat beside her, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face as she smiled up at him sleepily. "Good night, Daddy," she whispered, her voice soft and filled with trust. Ethan's heart swelled at the word, Daddy. It was a word he had thought he would never hear again, a word that meant everything to him now. "Good night, sweetheart," he whispered back, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you." "I love you too," she murmured, her eyes drifting closed. As Ethan watched her sleep, a deep sense of peace settled over him. The long, painful journey that had led him here was finally over. His daughter was home, and they had a future to look forward to, one they would build together, day by day. No matter what came next, they would face it as a family. And for Ethan, that was more than enough.